The night Thessaly Ashworth, Duchess of Ravenmore, turned 28. Her husband arrived at her birthday celebration with another woman on his arm. She did not scream. She did not weep. She did not flee the ballroom, not weep. She did not flee the ballroom like a wounded animal seeking the shadows. Instead, she set down her glass of champagne with a steadiness that surprised even herself, removed the sapphire ring from her finger, the very ring Aldrich had placed there on their wedding day 6 years prior, and walked directly toward them both. The guests fell silent. 300 people who had been laughing and dancing and pretending that the world was a kind place suddenly remembered that it was not. And what Thessaly said next would be whispered about in every drawing room across England for the next decade. But to understand that moment, one must first understand how she arrived at it. How a woman who had spent years perfecting the art of silence finally found her voice, and why, when she spoke, even the Duke himself could not find words to answer her. It began, as most tragedies do, with a marriage that looked perfect from the outside. Thessaly had been barely 22 when her father announced she would marry Aldrich Vane, the 5th Duke of Ravenmore. She had met him precisely 3 times before their wedding day, once at a ball where he had asked her to dance and commented on the weather with the enthusiasm of a man discussing ledger entries. Once at a garden party where he had bowed politely and spoken to her father about hunting while Thessaly stood beside them like a decorative plant. And once at their engagement dinner where he had looked at her across the table with eyes the color of slate and said, "I believe we shall suit each other well enough." Well enough. Those 2 words had defined her marriage from its very first breath. Aldrich was not cruel, not in the ways that mattered to society. He never raised his hand to her. He never shouted or threw objects or locked her in rooms. He simply treated her as one might treat a painting on the wall, pleasant to look at, occasionally acknowledged, largely ignored. For 6 years, Thessaly had performed her duties with mechanical precision. She managed his household with flawless efficiency, overseeing a staff of 43 servants and maintaining accounts that would have impressed the most fastidious banker. She hosted his dinner parties with grace and charm, remembering the names of every guest's children, their preferred wines, their political leanings. She visited tenants when they fell ill, organized charity events that raised thousands of pounds for orphanages and hospitals, smiled at his friends, and nodded along to his opinions as though they were pronouncements from God himself. And every single night, she slept alone in the East Wing while her husband occupied the West, the distance between them measured not merely in hallways, but in silences that stretched across years. She had told herself this was simply how marriages worked among their kind. Affection was a luxury. Passion was for novels. Duty was the only currency that mattered. But then had come Cibele Marchand. Thessaly first heard the name 6 months ago, whispered between 2 maids who had not realized she was standing just beyond the doorway. "The Duke has taken a new interest," one had giggled. "A French widow. They say she is exquisite." Exquisite. Thessaly had looked at her own reflection that night, searching for whatever it was she lacked. Her features were regular enough, dark hair that held a wave no amount of pins could fully tame. Eyes the color of strong tea, flecked with amber in certain lights. A figure that had remained slim despite the years, perhaps because she had never carried a child, perhaps because there had never been opportunity to conceive one. She was not exquisite. She had never been exquisite. She was merely acceptable, merely good enough, merely the daughter of an earl who had needed the Duke's money as desperately as the Duke had needed her family's ancient name. A transaction. That was all she had ever been. And now, standing in the doorway of her own birthday celebration, wearing a gown of deep burgundy silk that had taken 3 seamstresses 4 weeks to complete, Thessaly watched her husband escort Cibele Marchand into the ballroom as though he were presenting a queen. The woman was indeed exquisite, golden hair arranged in elaborate curls that caught the candlelight like spun honey. A figure that curved in all the places men seemed to appreciate, displayed to perfection in a gown cut lower than propriety strictly allowed. Pale blue silk that made her look like a statue come to life, beautiful and untouchable. She was smiling, and Aldrich, who had not smiled at Thessaly in longer than she could remember, was smiling back. The orchestra continued playing. The candles continued burning. The guests who had gathered to celebrate the Duchess's birthday continued breathing, though several of them had stopped mid-conversation to stare. Thessaly felt something crack inside her chest, not her heart. Her heart had hardened years ago, turning to stone through sheer necessity. No, this was something else. Something that had been building pressure for 6 long years, pressing against the walls she had constructed around herself, demanding release. And finally, it found one. The Duchess moved through the crowd with the kind of grace that only comes from years of practice, years of pretending, years of wearing a mask, so perfectly fitted that she had nearly forgotten her own face beneath it. Guests parted before her like water before a ship's prow. Some reached out as though to stop her, their gloved hands hovering uncertainly in the air. Others simply stared, their champagne glasses frozen halfway to their lips, their conversations abandoned mid-sentence. A few of the younger ladies exchanged glances that mingled horror with something that might have been admiration. Lady Ashford, who had been Thessaly's closest acquaintance since childhood, called out her name in a voice tight with warning. Thessaly did not pause. She could not pause. If she stopped now, she might never start moving again. Aldrich noticed her approach when she was perhaps 20 feet away. She watched his expression shift through several phases in rapid succession. Confusion first, as though he could not quite comprehend why his wife would be walking toward him with such purpose. Then irritation, the familiar tightening of his jaw that meant she was doing something that displeased him. Then, finally, a flicker of something that might have been alarm. Good. Let him be alarmed. Let him, for once, feel even a fraction of the uncertainty he had made her feel every single day of their marriage. Cybella Marchand saw her coming too. The Frenchwoman's smile faltered slightly, though she recovered quickly, arranging her features into an expression of polite curiosity, as though she were a guest at this party like any other, as though she had not just walked into another woman's home, on another woman's birthday, on another woman's husband's arm. The audacity of it was almost admirable. Almost. Thessaly stopped directly in front of them both. The music had quieted now, the orchestra trailing off into awkward silence as the musicians realized something significant was happening in the center of the room. The violinist's bow hovered above the strings, the cellist's hand stilled on her instrument. The hush that fell over the ballroom was so complete that Thessaly could hear the candles flickering in their sconces, could hear the rustle of silk as the assembled crowd held its collective breath. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Aldrich cleared his throat in that particular way he had, the sound he made when he was about to deliver a pronouncement he expected everyone to accept without question. "Thessaly," he said, his voice carrying across the silent room. "May I present Madame Cybella Marchand? She is newly arrived from Paris and knew no one in London. I thought it only charitable to ensure she had company this evening." Charitable. The word hung in the air between them like smoke. Thessaly looked at her husband, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time since their wedding day. He was still handsome in the way that wealthy men often were, their features maintained by good food and easy living. His dark hair showed the first threads of silver at the temples now, and there were lines around his eyes that had not been there when she had married him. But his posture remained imperious, his chin lifted at that angle which suggested he believed himself above reproach. He truly thought she would accept this. He truly believed that she would smile politely, welcome his mistress to her birthday celebration, and continue playing the role of dutiful wife, while society watched and whispered and pitied her. And why would he not believe it? She had given him no reason to expect otherwise. For years, she had accepted everything. Every silence that stretched between them at dinner, like an unbridgeable chasm. Every empty bed and corridor that echoed with loneliness. Every missed dinner and forgotten anniversary and casual dismissal. She had swallowed her pride so many times, it had become as natural as breathing. But there was only so much a person could swallow before they choked on it. Thessaly reached up and touched the sapphire ring on her left hand. It was a beautiful piece. She had always thought so. A deep blue stone surrounded by tiny diamonds, set in gold that had been in the Vane family for 7 generations. When Aldrich had slipped it onto her finger at their wedding, she had felt something like hope flutter in her chest. Perhaps, she had thought, perhaps this marriage might become something more than a transaction. Perhaps with time, with patience, with devotion, she might earn his affection. 6 years? She had given him 6 years, and he had given her this. Her fingers closed around the ring. She twisted it once, twice, felt it slide over her knuckle with surprising ease, as though it too was eager to be free. Aldrich's eyes widened. "Thessaly," he said, and there was a warning in his voice now, a tone she had heard him use with servants who had displeased him. "Whatever you are thinking of doing, I suggest you reconsider. This is neither the time nor the place for dramatics." Dramatics? She almost laughed. She had spent years avoiding dramatics, years being everything a duchess should be, years suffocating herself slowly so that he might breathe easier. And now, when she finally dared to act, he accused her of dramatics. The ring came free. She held it up, letting the candlelight catch the sapphire, letting everyone in the room see exactly what she was holding. Then she reached out, took Sibella Marchand's gloved hand in her own, and pressed the ring into the woman's palm. The Frenchwoman gasped, her composure finally cracking. Her fingers closed reflexively around the ring, her eyes darting between Thessaly and Aldrich, as though searching for some explanation that might make sense of what was happening. "Take him," Thessaly said, and her voice did not waver, did not break, did not betray any of the earthquake happening inside her chest. "Take the ring. Take the title. Take the bed that has been empty for years, and the silences and the feeling of being looked through as though you are made of glass." "Thessaly," Aldrich hissed, but she was not finished. "I have been your wife for 6 years," Thessaly continued, her voice carrying across the ballroom with a clarity that surprised even her. She had not raised it, had not shouted or shrieked. She simply spoke, and somehow that was more devastating than any scream could have been. 6 years of managing your household, entertaining your guests, tending to your tenants, and representing your name with perfect propriety. 6 years of sleeping alone while you found your pleasures elsewhere. 6 years of pretending not to notice the whispers, not to feel the pitying glances, not to die a little more inside each time you looked through me as though I were furniture. The ballroom remained deathly silent. Somewhere near the back, someone dropped a glass, the shattering sound almost obscenely loud in the hush. No one moved to clean it up. No one even glanced in that direction. Every eye in the room remained fixed on the tableau unfolding before them, and Thessaly knew that whatever happened next would define her for the rest of her life. She turned her gaze to Sibella, who stood frozen with the sapphire ring still pressed against her gloved palm. The Frenchwoman's exquisite face had gone pale, her earlier confidence evaporating like morning frost beneath an unforgiving sun. Whatever she had expected when she walked through those ballroom doors, it had not been this. "You think you have won something tonight," Thessaly said to her, and her tone held no malice, only a profound exhaustion that came from years of carrying a burden no one else could see. "You think you have claimed a prize worth having. So let me give you a gift, Madame Marchand. Let me tell you exactly what you have won." She took a step closer to the other woman, close enough to see the pulse fluttering rapidly in Sibella's throat, close enough to smell her perfume, something French and floral and far too expensive for a widow of modest means. You have won a man who has never once asked about my thoughts, my dreams, my fears, or my hopes. In all our years of marriage, he has never inquired what books I read, what music moves me, or what makes me laugh. I am not certain he knows my favorite color, or the name of my childhood home, or that I once wanted to be a painter before my father told me such ambitions were unsuitable for a lady of my station. Aldrich made a sound of protest, but Thessaly did not even glance at him. You have won a man who will give you jewels, but never his attention, who will dress you in silk, but never see you clearly, who will put a ring on your finger and a roof over your head and believe that these things constitute love, because he has never understood that love requires something he is incapable of giving. And what is that? Sibella whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. Her accent had thickened with emotion, the careful English she had cultivated slipping slightly to reveal the French beneath. Thessaly smiled then, and it was the saddest expression anyone in that room had ever seen. It was the smile of a woman who had learned something terrible about the world and could not unlearn it, no matter how desperately she wished she could. Himself, she said simply. He does not know how to give himself to another person, because he has never bothered to learn. He was raised to take, to acquire, to possess. And that is precisely what he will do with you. He will possess you until he grows bored. And then he will find another beautiful thing to add to his collection. And you will be left standing exactly where I am standing now, wondering what you did wrong, wondering why you were not enough. She stepped back, her gaze sweeping across the assembled guests, who stood frozen in their finery, champagne growing warm in their forgotten glasses. She saw Lady Ashford, with tears streaming down her face. She saw Lord Whitfield, with his jaw set in barely contained fury. She saw young Miss Hartley, barely 18, watching with wide eyes that seemed to be memorizing every word for future reference. But it will not be your fault, she continued, her voice carrying to the farthest corners of that magnificent room, just as it was never mine. Some men are simply born without the capacity to see beyond their own reflections, and no amount of beauty or devotion or sacrifice can change that fundamental truth. Finally, she turned to face her husband. Aldrich stood rigid, his face flushed with a color she had never seen before. Something between fury and shame, though she suspected he was far more capable of the former than the latter. His hands were clenched at his sides, and a vein pulsed visibly at his temple. For the first time in their marriage, he looked less like a duke and more like a cornered animal. "You forget yourself," he said through gritted teeth. "You are my wife, my Duchess. You will not speak to me this way in front of I was your wife," Thessaly interrupted calmly. "I was your Duchess. But you have made it abundantly clear, here, tonight, in front of everyone who matters in London society, that you do not want me. So I am giving you what you want." She gestured toward Sibella. "Take her. Marry her, if the law allows it after I am gone. Give her the title she clearly craves. But do not expect me to remain here and watch. Do not expect me to continue playing the gracious hostess while you parade your mistress through my home. Whatever small piece of dignity I have left, I intend to keep." "You have no money," Aldrich said, and there was a cruel edge to his voice now, a desperation poorly disguised as confidence. "Your father's debts were settled with your dowry. If you leave this house, you leave with nothing. Where will you go? What will you do? You have no skills, no trade, and no means of supporting yourself. You will be ruined within a fortnight." Thessaly felt the words land like physical blows, each one true, each one calculated to wound. He knew exactly where to strike, because he had spent years learning her vulnerabilities, while she had spent years learning his indifference. But something strange happened as the silence stretched between them. Instead of crumbling, instead of backing down, instead of doing what she had always done, and swallowing her pride for the sake of security, Thessaly felt something unexpected bloom in her chest. Relief. Pure, overwhelming relief. Because for the first time in years, she did not have to pretend anymore. She did not have to smile when she wanted to scream. She did not have to nod when she wanted to argue. She did not have to accept crumbs of affection and convince herself they were feasts. She was finished. "Then I shall be ruined," she said softly. "But at least I shall be ruined on my own terms." She turned away from him, from the woman still holding her wedding ring, from the guests who would dine out on this scandal for months to come. And she walked, one foot in front of the other, toward the grand doors of the ballroom, toward an uncertain future, toward a life that suddenly seemed terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. She was halfway across the marble floor when a voice rang out behind her. "Wait." Thessaly stopped, not because she wanted to, but because she recognized that voice, and it belonged to the very last person she had expected to speak. The voice belonged to Corvina Ashworth, Dowager Countess of Whitmore, Thessaly's grandmother. She turned slowly, disbelief momentarily cracking through the calm facade she had fought so hard to maintain. Her grandmother had not attended a society function in nearly 5 years, not since the death of Thessaly's grandfather had sent her into a retirement so complete that many assumed she had passed as well. She lived alone in the Whitmore estate in Derbyshire, corresponding only through letters and refusing all visitors, except Thessaly herself, who made the journey north twice each year. Yet here she stood, in the doorway of the Ravenmore ballroom, dressed in black silk that somehow made every other gown in the room look garish by comparison. Her silver hair was swept back severely from a face that bore the unmistakable stamp of the Ashworth bloodline, all sharp cheekbones and intelligent eyes, and a mouth that seemed perpetually poised between amusement and disapproval. At 73, Corvina Ashworth remained the most formidable woman Thessaly had ever known. "Grandmother," Thessaly breathed. "What are you doing here?" Corvina's gaze swept across the frozen tableau of the ballroom, taking in Aldrich's flushed face, Sibella's trembling form, the hundreds of guests who had collectively stopped breathing, and her granddaughter standing alone in the center of it all. Her expression revealed nothing, but Thessaly knew her well enough to recognize the steel beneath that placid surface. "I received word that my granddaughter might need me," she said, her voice carrying the same crystalline clarity that Thessaly's had moments before. "It seems my sources were correct." She moved into the room with the measured grace of a woman who had spent decades commanding attention simply by existing. The crowd parted before her with even more deference than they had shown Thessaly, for Corvina Ashworth was not merely a dowager countess. She was a legend. In her youth, she had been considered the greatest beauty of her generation. She had refused 7 proposals before accepting the Earl of Whitmore, and rumors persisted that at least 2 of her rejected suitors had never quite recovered from the disappointment. She had borne 4 children, buried 2 of them, managed estates spanning 3 counties, and advised no fewer than 2 prime ministers on matters they never publicly acknowledged. She was also, as everyone in society knew but rarely mentioned aloud, extraordinarily wealthy. The Ashworth fortune had not come from her marriage to the Earl. It had come from her own family, merchants who had made their money in trade with the Far East before buying their way into respectability. When Thessaly's father had squandered his portion through gambling and poor investments, he had been too proud to ask his mother for help. Instead, he had sold his daughter to a duke who needed an ancient name to offset the scandal of his own family's relatively recent elevation. Corvina had disapproved of the match from the beginning. She had told Thessaly so, plainly and without apology, the night before the wedding. That man has stone where his heart should be, she had said. He will never warm to you, no matter how brightly you burn. You will spend your life throwing yourself against walls and wondering why you cannot break through. Thessaly had not listened. She had been young and hopeful and desperate to believe that love could be cultivated like a garden, given enough patience and care. She had been so terribly wrong, and now her grandmother stood before her, and the expression on Corvina's face was not one of triumph or vindication. It was something far more painful. It was compassion. "Come, child," Corvina said gently, extending one gloved hand. "You have said what needed to be said. There is no need to remain here any longer." Thessaly felt her throat tighten. She had not wept through any of this, had not allowed herself even a single tear as she faced down her husband and his mistress. But something about her grandmother's voice, the gentleness underlying the steel, threatened to undo her completely. She took a step toward Corvina's outstretched hand. "Now wait just a moment." Aldrich's voice cut through the air like a blade. He strode forward, his earlier shock apparently transformed into righteous indignation. The color in his face had deepened, and his eyes had taken on a dangerous glitter that Thessaly recognized from the few occasions she had seen him truly angry. "You cannot simply walk in here and take my wife," he said to Corvina, as though Thessaly herself were not standing right there. "Whatever grievances she imagines she has, they are a matter between husband and wife, not some interfering old woman who should have stayed in her country grave." The collective gasp that rippled through the ballroom was audible. Even Sibella, still clutching the sapphire ring, looked horrified by the insult. Corvina, however, merely raised one silver eyebrow. "Your wife," she repeated, the words dripping with disdain. "You forfeited the right to call her that the moment you walked through those doors with your mistress on your arm. On her birthday, no less. At a celebration held in her honor, in her own home." She took a step toward Aldrich, and despite being more than a head shorter than him, she somehow managed to make him seem small. "You are not a stupid man, Ravenmore. Cruel, certainly. Selfish, undoubtedly. But not stupid, so you must have known what you were doing tonight. You must have understood that parading your paramour before witnesses would humiliate your wife beyond all bearing. Which means you did it deliberately." Her eyes narrowed. "The question is why? What could you possibly hope to gain from such a public display of disrespect?" Aldrich's jaw worked silently for a moment. Then, with visible effort, he composed his features into something resembling dignity. "My personal affairs are none of your concern," he said stiffly. "Your personal affairs became my concern the moment they touched my granddaughter," Corvina replied. "And now, Ravenmore, you will listen very carefully to what I am about to say." She glanced briefly at Thessaly, something passing between them that needed no words. Then she returned her attention to the Duke. "Thessaly Ashworth came to you with nothing but her name and her father's debts," Corvina said, her voice carrying to every corner of the silent ballroom. "You paid those debts, I am aware. You consider that transaction complete. But you seem to have forgotten one rather crucial detail." She paused, letting the tension build until it was almost unbearable. "I am still alive." Aldrich's expression flickered with something that might have been unease, a crack in his carefully constructed armor that Thessaly had never seen before. "When my granddaughter married you," Corvina continued, "I made certain provisions in my will. Provisions that would ensure her security regardless of how her marriage fared. I had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that such provisions would never be necessary, that you would treat her with the respect she deserved, that the warmth of her spirit might eventually reach whatever distant thing passes for your heart." She shook her head slowly. "I see now that I was overly optimistic. Whatever provisions you have made are irrelevant," Aldrich said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. A wife's property belongs to her husband under the law. Any inheritance Thessaly receives becomes mine by right." Corvina smiled then, and it was not a pleasant expression. It was the smile of a woman who had been waiting years for this moment. "How fortunate that I employed solicitors rather cleverer than you," she said. "My estate is structured quite specifically to prevent exactly that outcome. The inheritance is held in trust, administered by 3 independent trustees of impeccable reputation, parties entirely outside your reach, and accessible only to Thessaly herself. The terms are ironclad, drafted by men who have spent their careers ensuring that wealthy families cannot be despoiled by fortune hunters and unworthy connections." She paused, allowing her words to sink in. "Should she choose to leave you, she would do so with an income of £12,000 per annum, plus a house in London, a substantial property in Brighton, with gardens that overlook the sea, and a rather charming villa in Italy that I've been saving for precisely this occasion. The villa, incidentally, was purchased before your marriage. Even had I wished to include it in Thessaly's dowry, which I most certainly did not, it would have been beyond your legal reach." The murmur that swept through the assembled guests was like wind through autumn leaves, carrying whispers of astonishment and something that might have been approval. 12,000 a year was not merely comfortable, it was wealthy, it was independent. It was everything Aldrich had claimed Thessaly would lose by leaving him, and more besides. "You are lying," he said, but his voice had gone thin and reedy. "I have never lied in my life," Corvina replied. "I find it tedious and unnecessary. Unlike you, Ravenmore, I have no need to deceive others to get what I want. I simply take it." She turned back to Thessaly and extended her hand once more. "The choice is yours, my dear. Stay here and continue suffering indignities I cannot bear to witness, or come with me tonight and begin your life anew. I will not force you either way. But I want you to understand, completely and irrevocably, that you do have a choice, that you have always had a choice, and that whatever your husband has told you about your helplessness was nothing but another cage he built to keep you captive." Thessaly stood frozen, her mind racing through implications she could barely comprehend. 12,000 a year, a house in London, freedom. It seemed impossible. It seemed like a dream she might wake from at any moment, finding herself back in her bedchamber in the East Wing, alone as always, trapped as always. But her grandmother's hand remained extended, real and solid and waiting. And Sibella Marchand still held her wedding ring, and her husband stood there with fury burning in his eyes, and Thessaly realized with sudden, startling clarity that she felt nothing for him at all. Not love, certainly, but not even hatred. Just a vast, echoing emptiness where some emotion should have been. She had given him everything she had, and he had given her nothing in return. There was nothing left to lose. Thessaly stepped forward and took her grandmother's hand. The sound Aldrich made was not quite human. Something between a growl and a gasp, the noise of a man watching his property walk away from him without permission. "If you leave this house," he snarled, "you will never return. I will not take you back. I will not forgive this humiliation. You will be dead to me, Thessaly. Do you understand? Dead." Thessaly looked at him over her shoulder. Really looked, perhaps for the last time. "I have been dead to you for years," she said gently. "The only difference now is that I will finally be alive to myself." She turned away from him, and she walked out of the ballroom, her grandmother's hand warm in her own, leaving behind the sapphire ring, the whispered scandals, and the man who had never learned to love her. But as they reached the grand entrance hall, as the cool night air rushed in through the open doors, carrying the scent of rain and possibility, Thessaly heard footsteps behind them. Quick footsteps, urgent footsteps. and a voice she did not recognize called out, "Please, Your Grace. Wait, there is something you must know. Something about your husband that changes everything." Thessaly turned. A young woman stood in the shadows of the hallway, dressed in the plain gray dress of a household servant. Her face was pale and frightened, and her hands were trembling visibly at her sides. But it was her eyes that caught Thessaly's attention. They were filled with a desperate, burning determination. The same determination Thessaly had felt just moments ago, when she had finally found the courage to speak. "Who are you?" Thessaly asked. The servant girl swallowed hard. "My name is Marin Blackwood," she said. "I was your husband's chambermaid, and I know why he brought that woman here tonight. I know what he is planning. And if you leave now, without hearing what I have to say, you will be playing directly into his hands." Thessaly felt her grandmother's grip tighten on her hand, a silent warning. The entrance hall felt suddenly oppressive, the air heavy with the weight of unspoken secrets. Behind them, she could hear the distant murmur of the ballroom, voices rising from their shocked silence into the eager buzz of scandal. But here in the shadows, there was only the servant girl with her frightened eyes and trembling hands, and the weight of words not yet spoken. "We should leave," Corvina said in a low voice. "Whatever this girl has to say can wait until we are safely away from this house." "With respect, my lady," Marin said, and there was steel beneath her fear. "It cannot wait. The Duke's men will be looking for me within the hour. Once they realize I have gone, they will hunt me down. This may be the only chance I have to speak." Thessaly studied the girl more closely. She was young, perhaps 19 or 20, with dark hair pulled back severely from a face that might have been pretty under different circumstances. There were shadows beneath her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights, and her hands bore the rough redness of someone who worked constantly, scrubbing and polishing and tending to the endless needs of a great house. A chambermaid. One of dozens who moved through Ravenmoor Hall like ghosts, unseen and unacknowledged by the family they served. Thessaly had passed this girl in the corridors countless times without truly seeing her, a fact that now filled her with shame. But this girl had seen something, had heard something, and whatever it was, had driven her to risk everything by approaching the Duchess directly. "What is it you know?" Thessaly asked. Marin glanced nervously toward the ballroom, as though expecting Aldrich himself to emerge at any moment. "Not here," she said. "There is a servant's entrance through the east corridor. It leads to the garden." "Please, Your Grace, if you will give me just 5 minutes, I will tell you everything, and then you can decide whether to continue walking away or whether to stay and fight." Fight. The word hung in the air between them. Thessaly had not been thinking of fighting. She had been thinking of escape, of freedom, of finally breathing air that was not poisoned by her husband's indifference. The idea of returning to battle, of engaging further with a man she wanted only to forget, filled her with exhaustion so profound it settled into her very bones. But something in the servant girl's voice gave her pause. "This is a trap," Corvina said flatly. "Some scheme of Ravenmoor's to lure you back inside." "No, my lady," Marin said, and her voice cracked slightly. "I swear on my mother's grave, I mean the Duchess, no harm. I have served in this house for 3 years. I have watched her suffer in silence while the Duke took his pleasures elsewhere. I have seen her kindness to the staff, her quiet dignity, and her refusal to become bitter, despite everything he has done to her." She met Thessaly's eyes directly. "You are the only person in this house who has ever treated me as human. When I was ill 2 winters past, you sent your own physician to tend me. When my mother died, you gave me leave to attend the funeral and paid for the burial yourself. You did not have to do those things. Most ladies would not have." Thessaly remembered both occasions, though she had not thought them significant at the time. Simple kindnesses. the bare minimum of human decency. But apparently, in a house as unfeeling as Ravenmore Hall, even the bare minimum was rare enough to be remarkable. "What is it you wish to tell me?" Thessaly asked again. Marin took a shaky breath. "Your husband is not merely conducting an affair with Madame Marchand," she said. "He is planning to marry her." Corvina let out a sharp laugh. "He cannot marry her. He is already married." "English law does not permit I know what English law permits," Marin interrupted, and the desperation in her voice made her bold. "But the Duke does not intend to seek a divorce. He does not intend to wait for her Grace's death. He has found another way." The entrance hall seemed to grow darker, the shadows deeper, as though the very walls were leaning in to listen. "What way?" Thessaly heard herself ask, though some part of her already knew she did not want to hear the answer. Marin's eyes filled with tears that she blinked back furiously. "I was cleaning his study 3 weeks ago," she said. "He did not know I was there. He was meeting with a man, a solicitor I had never seen before. They were discussing documents. Legal documents that would prove the Duke's marriage to you was never valid in the first place. Invalid." Corvina's voice was sharp. "On what grounds?" Marin hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor. "They spoke of the ceremony," she said in a hushed tone. "The vicar who performed it. Apparently there were irregularities. The license was improperly filed. The witnesses were not who they claimed to be." She looked up again, and the tears were falling now, streaking down her cheeks. "The Duke paid to have these irregularities created, Your Grace. Years ago, before he even married you. He built a trap into the very foundation of your marriage, so that he could escape it whenever he wished. And now he has decided that the time has come to spring that trap." Thessaly felt as though the floor had dropped away beneath her feet. Everything she had believed about her marriage, about her position, about her very identity, was suddenly revealed to be nothing more than an elaborate fiction. She had spent years believing herself to be the Duchess of Ravenmore, had signed documents and attended functions, and introduced herself by that title thousands of times. And now this servant girl was telling her that none of it had ever been real. The cruelty of it was almost incomprehensible. Not merely an affair, not merely emotional neglect, but a systematic destruction of her entire legal existence, planned and executed with the precision of a military campaign. The silence that followed was absolute. Thessaly felt the world tilting beneath her feet, all her assumptions crumbling like sand castles before an incoming tide. 6 years. She had been his wife for 6 years. But according to what this girl was saying, she had never been his wife at all. "You must understand," Marin continued urgently, "what this means. If the marriage is declared invalid, you lose everything. Not just your position, not just your home, but your reputation, your standing, your very identity. You would be cast out of society entirely. No respectable person would receive you. No decent household would employ you. You would be ruined, Your Grace. Completely and utterly ruined." Thessaly opened her mouth to respond, but no sound emerged. Her grandmother, however, had no such difficulty. "Where is this solicitor now?" Corvina demanded. "Where are the documents he created?" "I do not know," Marin admitted, "but I know where the Duke keeps his most important papers. His private study has a hidden compartment behind the portrait of his father. I have seen him access it when he thought he was alone." Corvina's eyes narrowed with calculating intensity. "And you would lead us there?" Marin nodded, her jaw set with determination despite her tears. "I would do anything to help her Grace," she said. "She is the only good thing in this house, and I will not stand by and watch the Duke destroy her without lifting a finger to prevent it." Thessaly finally found her voice. "Why?" she asked. "Why would he do this now? After all this time, why would he choose tonight of all nights?" She stopped. The answer hit her with the force of a physical blow. He wanted me to leave, she breathed. He brought Sabella here deliberately. He humiliated me publicly because he knew I would finally break. He wanted me to walk out that door of my own accord. Because if you leave voluntarily, Marin said in a hushed voice, it makes the annulment easier. He can claim desertion. He can paint you as an unstable wife who abandoned her husband without cause. The perfect crime, Corvina murmured, executed in plain sight before witnesses. Thessaly stood very still, feeling the trap close around her from a direction she had never anticipated. She had thought she was escaping. She had thought she was finally free. But in walking away, she had been doing exactly what Aldrich wanted her to do. And somewhere in that ballroom, her husband was probably already celebrating his victory. For a long moment, Thessaly could not move. The weight of understanding pressed down upon her chest like a stone, making each breath an effort. Years of confusion, of wondering what she had done wrong, of searching for some flaw in herself that explained her husband's distance. And now, finally, the truth emerged in all its calculated cruelty. He had never intended to love her. He had never intended to stay married to her. From the very beginning, from the moment he had slipped that sapphire ring onto her finger and spoken vows he never meant to keep, Aldrich had been planning this, building his escape route brick by brick while she exhausted herself trying to earn affection that was never available to be earned. She was not a wife. She had never been a wife. She was a placeholder, a convenient arrangement, a name on a document that could be erased whenever it suited him. The rage that rose in her then was unlike anything she had ever experienced. It was not the hot, explosive anger that burns bright and fades quickly. This was something deeper, something ancient and primal, rising from a place inside her that she had not known existed. Something that settled into her bones and whispered that she would not go quietly into the ruin he had prepared for her. All those years of swallowing her pride, of accepting his indifference, of telling herself that this was simply how marriages worked among their kind. All those years of believing that if she was patient enough, devoted enough, perfect enough, she might eventually earn his regard. And now she understood that her patience had been nothing more than fuel for his contempt. Her devotion had been a tool he had used against her. Her perfection had been a cage she had built around herself, one bar at a time, while he watched and waited for the moment when it would be complete enough to trap her forever. No more. She would not give him the satisfaction of her destruction. She would not slink away into obscurity and let him rewrite the story of their marriage to serve his purposes. If he wanted a fight, she would give him one. And she would fight with every weapon at her disposal, every connection her grandmother had cultivated, every ounce of intelligence she had spent years suppressing because her husband found clever women tedious. Thessaly straightened her spine. "Show me," she said to Marin. "Show me where these documents are hidden." Corvina caught her arm. "Think carefully, child. If we are caught searching his study, he will have even more ammunition against you. He could claim you were attempting to steal from him." "Then we must not be caught," Thessaly replied, and her voice had taken on a quality she did not recognize, something hard and bright and utterly determined. "He has spent years weaving this trap. He believes he knows exactly how I will react, exactly what I will do. He expects me to run. He expects me to hide. He expects me to crumble." She met her grandmother's eyes. "I am finished being what he expects." Corvina studied her for a long moment. Then, slowly, a smile spread across her weathered face. "There she is," she said, with quiet satisfaction. "There is the girl I remember, the one who used to climb trees and argue with her tutors and swear she would never let any man tell her what to do." She squeezed Thessaly's hand. "Very well. Let us retrieve these documents. And then let us see just how clever the Duke of Ravenmore truly believes himself to be. Marin led them through a maze of servants' corridors that Thessaly had never known existed. The walls here were plain whitewashed plaster, the floors bare wood, worn smooth by generations of hurrying feet. Gas lamps flickered at intervals, casting dancing shadows that made every corner seem threatening. The sounds of the ballroom faded behind them, replaced by the distant clatter of the kitchen and the murmur of servants going about their duties. Several maids passed them in the corridor, their eyes widening at the sight of the Duchess in her burgundy gown moving through spaces she had never before entered. None of them spoke. None of them tried to stop her. If anything, Thessaly saw something that might have been hope kindling in their faces. "His study is on the second floor," Marin whispered as they climbed a narrow staircase, "but he rarely leaves it unlocked." "I do not know if I have a key," Thessaly said. Both Marin and Corvina turned to stare at her. Thessaly reached into the hidden pocket sewn into the seam of her gown and withdrew a small brass key. "He does not know I have it," she explained. "I found it 3 years ago, behind a loose stone in the fireplace of his bedchamber. I was searching for some evidence that he ever thought of me at all. Letters, perhaps. A gift he had bought, but forgotten. Something." Her mouth twisted. "Instead, I found this key, and a bundle of correspondence from women whose names I did not recognize. I put the letters back, but the key I kept." "Why?" Corvina asked. Thessaly considered the question. "I do not know," she admitted. "Some instinct, perhaps. Some part of me that knew a day might come when I needed access to his secrets." She looked at the key in her palm, tarnished now with age and neglect. "I never imagined it would be a day like this." They reached the landing of the second floor. The corridor here was richly carpeted, the walls hung with portraits of Aldrich's ancestors, men and women with distant eyes and haughty expressions. The family resemblance was unmistakable. Generation after generation of Vines, all wearing the same look of superiority, as though the world existed merely to serve their needs. "There," Marin pointed to a door at the far end of the corridor. "That is his private study. He allows no one inside except his valet, and occasionally, guests he wishes to impress." They moved quickly down the hall, Thessaly's slippers silent on the thick carpet. The door was solid oak, reinforced with iron bands that spoke of secrets worth protecting. She slid the key into the lock and felt it turn with a soft click that seemed impossibly loud in the corridor's silence. The study beyond was dark, lit only by the faint glow of moonlight filtering through heavy velvet drapes. Thessaly stepped inside, her heart pounding against her ribs, and immediately caught the scent of her husband's cologne, sandalwood, and something darker underneath. She had been in this room only once before, on the day of their wedding, when Aldrich had brought her here to show her the family documents she would need to sign. He had stood behind her as she wrote her name, close enough that she could feel his breath on her neck, and she had foolishly interpreted that proximity as intimacy. Now she understood it for what it was: surveillance, control, the watchful presence of a predator ensuring his prey had no opportunity to escape. "The portrait," Marin said, pointing to a massive painting that dominated the wall behind the desk. "His father, the 4th Duke. The hidden compartment is behind it." Thessaly approached the painting, studying the face of the man who had raised her husband. The 4th Duke had been dead for 15 years, but his likeness still radiated the same authority that Aldrich wore like a second skin. Dark eyes, thin lips, a jaw set in permanent disapproval. Whatever capacity for warmth the Vane bloodline might once have possessed, it had clearly been bred out generations ago. She reached up and gripped the edge of the heavy gilt frame, and froze. Footsteps, coming down the corridor, coming fast. There was no time to run. Thessaly released the portrait frame and spun toward her grandmother and Marin, her mind racing through impossible options. The footsteps were growing louder, accompanied now by voices, men's voices, speaking in low, urgent tones. Under the desk, Corvina commanded, her voice barely a whisper. "Both of you. Now." "But grandmother, I am a 73-year-old woman who wandered into the wrong room looking for a privy," Corvina interrupted, already composing her features into an expression of confused innocence. "They will not dare manhandle me. But if they find you here, everything is lost. Go." There was no time to argue. Thessaly grabbed Marin's hand and pulled her toward the massive mahogany desk that dominated the center of the room. The space beneath it was cramped, barely large enough for one person, let alone two. But somehow, they managed to fold themselves into the shadows, pressing against each other in the darkness, breathing as softly as humanly possible. Thessaly's heart hammered against her ribs with such force that she was certain the sound must be audible throughout the room. Her burgundy gown rustled with every breath, and she pressed her hand against her chest, as if she could somehow muffle the thundering of her pulse. Beside her, Marin had gone completely still, her body rigid with terror, her eyes squeezed shut as if she could will herself invisible. The dust beneath the desk tickled Thessaly's nose, and she felt a desperate urge to sneeze that she barely managed to suppress. The air was thick with the smell of furniture polish and old paper, and the faint, lingering trace of Aldrich's cologne. Every sensation seemed magnified, every sound amplified. The distant murmur of the party, the creak of floorboards in the corridor, the measured breathing of her grandmother, who stood between them, and discovery with nothing but her wits and her reputation as weapons. Thessaly could see Corvina's skirts through a gap between the desk's carved panels. Her grandmother moved toward the door with remarkable composure, reaching it just as it swung open. Light flooded the room. What in God's name? Thessaly recognized that voice. Aldrich, and he was not alone. "Oh, thank heavens," Corvina said, her voice taking on a querulous quality Thessaly had never heard before. The doddering old woman, confused and lost. "I've been wandering these corridors for an age. Why must your house be so dreadfully large? I was merely searching for a retiring room." "This is my private study," Aldrich said. "How did you get in here?" "The door was locked." "Was it?" Corvina sounded genuinely bewildered. "How very odd. I simply turned the handle and it opened. Perhaps your servants forgot to secure it properly." A pause. Thessaly held her breath. "Where's my wife?" Aldrich demanded. "Your wife?" Corvina's confusion seemed to deepen. "I thought she was in the ballroom. Is she not there?" "We were speaking earlier, and she seemed rather upset. Something about a French woman, though I could not quite follow the conversation. My hearing is not what it once was, you understand. Do not play games with me, old woman." Corvina's sharp laugh cut through the room. "Old woman," she repeated, and the confused act dropped away like a discarded mask. "Yes, I suppose I am that. But I am also the only person in this house who is not afraid of you, Ravenmore, and I am certainly not foolish enough to tell you where my granddaughter has gone." "She has not left the estate," another voice said. A man Thessaly did not recognize. "We have men at all the exits. No carriage has departed since the party began." "Then she is hiding somewhere," Aldrich said. "Find her. Search every room if you must. I want her found within the hour." "On what grounds?" Corvina demanded. "She is your wife, not your prisoner. Or has that distinction become unclear to you?" Thessaly heard her husband take a step closer to her grandmother. "Your granddaughter has publicly humiliated me in front of everyone who matters in London society," he said, his voice dropping to something dangerous. "She has made wild accusations, caused a scene, and now she is skulking about my house like a common thief. I want to know what she is planning." "Perhaps she is planning to leave you," Corvina suggested pleasantly. "That would seem the sensible course, given the circumstances." "She cannot leave me. We are married." "Are you?" Corvina's voice sharpened. How interesting that you should be so certain of that, given what I have recently learned about the validity of your union." The silence that followed was like the moment before lightning strikes. "What did you say?" Aldrich's voice had gone very soft. "You heard me perfectly well." Another long pause. Then Aldrich spoke again, and his tone had changed completely. It was no longer angry or imperious. It was something far more frightening. It was calm. "Leave us," he said. "Flemington, see the Dowager Countess to her carriage. She will be departing immediately." "I most certainly will not." "You will," Aldrich interrupted, "or I will have you removed by force. This is my house, my estate, my authority. Whatever fantasies you have entertained about rescuing your granddaughter, they end now." Thessaly heard scuffling, heard her grandmother's sharp protest, heard the heavy footsteps of men who did not care about courtesy or dignity. And then, silence. The door closed, and Aldrich remained in the room. Thessaly felt Marin's hand tighten on her arm, felt the younger woman's body trembling with fear. She did not dare move, did not dare breathe, did not dare do anything but pray that her husband would leave. "I know you are in here, Thessaly." His voice echoed in the darkness. "Your grandmother's performance was admirable, but ultimately unconvincing. She would not have come to this room by accident, and she would not have deflected so desperately unless she was protecting something. Footsteps, moving closer, or someone." Thessaly closed her eyes. "I taught you nothing about deception during our marriage," Aldrich continued, his voice almost conversational now. "Perhaps I should have. You might have proven more useful with such skills." The footsteps stopped, right in front of the desk. "Come out," he said. "Whatever you hope to find here, you have failed. Whatever you hope to accomplish tonight, it is over. Come out, and we will discuss this like civilized people." Thessaly did not move. "Or," Aldrich said, and now his voice carried a thread of menace, "I can call my men back and have them drag you out like the disobedient animal you have apparently become. The choice is yours." She could not stay hidden. She could not let Marin be discovered. She could not let him win. Slowly, painfully, Thessaly unfolded herself from beneath the desk and rose to her feet. Her husband smiled. "There you are," Aldrich said, and his smile widened into something that did not reach his eyes. "My wandering wife." I was beginning to worry. Thessaly stood before him in the moonlit study, acutely aware of Marin still crouched beneath the desk, hidden by shadows and the sweep of Thessaly's skirts. If Aldrich looked too closely, if he demanded she step away from the desk, the servant girl would be discovered. And whatever protection Thessaly might hope to claim for herself as his wife, however false that claim might be, Marin would have none. She had to keep his attention on her. She had to be enough to fill his vision. "You wanted me to leave," Thessaly said, and she was proud of how steady her voice remained. "That was the entire point of bringing Sibella here tonight. You wanted me to walk out that door in a fit of rage and despair." Aldrich tilted his head, studying her as one might study an insect that had suddenly demonstrated unexpected behavior. "And yet here you are," he said, "not fleeing, not weeping in some corner, but breaking into my private study in the company of your meddling grandmother." He stepped closer, and Thessaly forced herself not to retreat. "What were you looking for, Thessaly? What secrets did you imagine you might find?" She met his gaze directly. "The documents," she said. "The ones that prove our marriage was deliberately sabotaged from the beginning. The falsified license, the fraudulent witnesses, the trap you built into our union so you could escape it whenever you chose." Something flickered in Aldrich's eyes. Surprise, perhaps. Or perhaps merely annoyance that his careful schemes had been exposed. "Who told you that?" he asked. "Does it matter?" "It matters very much." He circled around her, a predator assessing prey. "Someone in my household has been indiscreet, I will need to address that problem once you and I have finished our conversation." Thessaly's heart clenched. She could not let him discover Marin, could not let another person suffer for trying to help her. "No one told me," she said quickly. "I found the documents myself months ago. I have been waiting for the right moment to confront you." Aldrich stopped circling. "You are lying," he said flatly. "You never enter this study. You have no key. And even if you had somehow gained access, you would not have known where to look." He stepped closer still, close enough now that she could smell his cologne, could see the fine lines around his eyes, could feel the hostility radiating from him. "But no matter," he continued. "The documents are no longer here. I moved them weeks ago, once I realized how close we were to the final phase." "Final phase?" "Of our arrangement, Thessaly." He said her name as though it tasted sour on his tongue. "You were always meant to be temporary," he continued. "A stepping stone. Your father's ancient name gave my family the legitimacy we needed to complete our rise in society. But that usefulness has expired. The connections are made, the invitations secured. I no longer require the Ashworth bloodline to open doors for me." "And Sibella?" Thessaly asked. "She is your next stepping stone?" Aldrich smiled again. "Sibella is many things you could never be," he said. "Beautiful, passionate, alive." He reached out and touched her cheek, a mockery of tenderness. "You were always so dreadfully proper, Thessaly, so correct and lifeless. I tried in the beginning to summon some feeling for you, but it was like trying to warm myself by an empty hearth." Thessaly felt his words land like blows, but she did not flinch. "I was distant," she said, "because you never gave me any warmth to respond to. I was lifeless because you drained the life from me drop by drop, day by day, until there was nothing left." She stepped back from his touch. "I loved you, Aldrich. When we married, I loved you. I did not know you, but I was prepared to spend my life learning. I was prepared to be patient, to be understanding, to be everything you needed." Her voice hardened. "But you never wanted a wife. You wanted a possession, and when you grew tired of me, you simply began planning how to dispose of me most conveniently." A harsh laugh escaped him. "Dispose of you? I am setting you free. Once the annulment is finalized, you can do whatever you wish. Return to your grandmother's estate, travel abroad, marry again if anyone will have you." "With my reputation destroyed," Thessaly said, "with society believing I was never truly your wife, with every door closed to me because of the scandal you have engineered. That," Aldrich said, "is not my concern." They stood facing each other in the moonlit darkness, husband and wife in name only, two people who had shared a home for years and never truly known each other at all. Then Thessaly did something unexpected. She smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was not a kind smile. It was the smile of someone who has finally seen the board clearly and realized she has more pieces than her opponent believes. "You have made one miscalculation," she said. Aldrich's eyes narrowed. "And what is that?" "You assumed I would be alone." The door to the study burst open, and there stood Corvina Ashworth, flanked by two men in the dark coats of King's Council, their faces grim with professional purpose. Behind them came 3 constables from the Metropolitan Police, and in their hands they carried documents bearing the Duke of Ravenmore's own seal. Aldrich's composure shattered. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his voice rising to a pitch Thessaly had never heard before. "This is my house. You cannot simply barge in here with—" "We can, actually," one of the King's Council interrupted calmly. His name was Hartwick, and Thessaly recognized him now from her grandmother's descriptions. One of the finest legal minds in England, and utterly incorruptible. When we have evidence of conspiracy to commit fraud upon the Church, forgery of legal documents, and corruption of court officers, We can do rather a lot of things." "This is preposterous," Aldrich sputtered. "Whatever documents you believe you have were recovered from the offices of your solicitor, Mr. Pembury, approximately 2 hours ago," Hartwick continued smoothly. "Madame Marchand first approached us more than a month ago with evidence of your scheme. Your grandmother," he nodded toward Thessaly, "subsequently contacted us 3 weeks past to add her own suspicions. We have been coordinating our investigation ever since." Thessaly stared at her grandmother. "A month ago," she whispered. "I told you I had made provisions," her grandmother replied, moving to stand beside her. "Did you think I meant only the financial ones? I have been watching Ravenmore for years, child, waiting for him to make a mistake large enough to destroy him." Her eyes glittered with satisfaction. Tonight, he finally obliged. Aldrich had gone very pale. The documents in the constable's hands seemed to drain the blood from his face, leaving him gray and somehow smaller than he had been moments before. "Those were obtained illegally," he said, but his voice had lost its authority. "Whatever your men took from Pembury's offices, it cannot be used against me." "I will have every one of you prosecuted for your solicitor," Hartwick interrupted again. "Was quite cooperative once we explained the consequences of his continued silence. It seems his loyalty to you extended only as far as his fear of imprisonment. When faced with the choice between protecting your secrets and protecting his own freedom, he chose rather predictably." He paused, "As did your valet, your forger, and the vicar you paid to falsify the marriage certificate." The silence that followed was devastating. Thessaly watched her husband's face cycle through emotion after emotion. Fury, disbelief, calculation, and finally, beneath it all, something she had never expected to see there. Fear. Real, genuine fear. The kind of fear that comes when a man realizes that all his careful plans have crumbled to dust, that the web he has spent years weaving has caught no one but himself. Aldrich's hands trembled slightly at his sides, and Thessaly noticed for the first time how small he looked, without his armor of arrogance and certainty. How ordinary. How pathetic. She had spent years being afraid of this man, years walking on eggshells around his moods, years modulating her voice and her opinions and her very existence to avoid his displeasure. And now she saw that there had never been anything to fear at all. He was not a monster. He was merely a man, and a small one at that, whose power had always rested on nothing more substantial than her willingness to submit to it. "This changes nothing," Aldrich said, but even he seemed to know the words were hollow. "You cannot prove anything. My solicitor will recant. The others will recant. By the time this reaches court." "The time for courts has passed," Corvina said. She stepped forward, and despite her age, despite her size, she seemed suddenly as imposing as any of the men in the room. "You have spent years tormenting my granddaughter, years treating her as less than human, years planning to cast her aside like refuse when you had extracted every ounce of usefulness from her." Her voice hardened. "Did you truly believe no one was watching? Did you truly believe your cruelty would go unanswered?" Aldrich opened his mouth to respond, and then a new voice spoke from the doorway. He believed exactly that. Everyone turned. Sibella Marchand stood in the entrance to the study, her pale blue gown luminous in the lamplight, her beautiful face arranged in an expression of calculation that Thessaly had not seen there before. "Because I encouraged him to believe it," she continued. "I told him you were weak, Duchess. I told him you would crumble at the first sign of pressure. I told him your grandmother was an irrelevant old woman whose threats meant nothing." She stepped into the room, and Thessaly noticed that she no longer held the sapphire ring. It rested now in a velvet pouch at one constable's belt, seized as evidence of the fraud. "I was very convincing," Sibella said. "It is, after all, what he paid me to be." Aldrich stared at her in horrified disbelief. Sibella? Madame Marchand came to us first, Hardwick explained, something almost like satisfaction warming his usually dry voice. She approached our offices more than a month ago with evidence of your scheme, after you attempted to recruit her as a participant in your fraud. You, Aldrich whispered, and the single word contained more venom than Thessaly had ever heard from him. You treacherous. Sibella laughed, and it was not a pleasant sound. You approached me with an offer to destroy an innocent woman's life in exchange for a title and a fortune. You assumed I would accept because I was beautiful, and French, and widowed, and therefore, in your estimation, desperate and amoral. She moved closer to him, her eyes blazing. You assumed wrong. Marin emerged from beneath the desk, finally free from hiding, and went to stand beside Thessaly. The young servant's face was streaked with tears, but her expression held the same fierce triumph that Thessaly felt blazing in her own chest. You see, Aldrich, Thessaly said in a low voice, that is the miscalculation I mentioned. You spent so many years treating everyone around you as objects to be used and discarded. You never considered that those objects might decide to use you in return. She stepped forward, close enough to look directly into her husband's eyes. I am not your wife, she said. You ensured that when you corrupted our marriage before it even began. But I was your victim for years. And now, finally, I am your reckoning. The constables moved forward, and Aldrich Vane, 5th Duke of Ravenmore, did not resist as they placed him in irons. The scandal that erupted in the following weeks was unlike anything London society had witnessed in a generation. The Duke of Ravenmore, arrested in his own home on charges of fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. His carefully constructed schemes laid bare in court documents that became the favorite reading material of every drawing room in England. His supposed mistress revealed as an agent of his destruction rather than an instrument of his pleasure. His wife, or rather the woman society had believed to be his wife, transformed overnight from an object of pity into a figure of fascinated admiration. The newspapers could not print enough copies to meet demand. The scandal sheets worked their presses around the clock, and in every corner of the city, from the grandest ballrooms to the humblest taverns, people discussed the Duchess who had finally said enough. Thessaly weathered it all with the same composure that had carried her through years of silent suffering. But now, that composure came from strength rather than submission. She moved into her grandmother's London townhouse the night of the arrest, and did not return to Ravenmore Hall. She had no desire to see the place again, no attachment to the rooms where she had spent so many lonely nights, no sentiment for the gilded cage that had never truly been her home. The legal proceedings that followed were complex and exhausting. Because the marriage had been deliberately invalidated from its inception, Thessaly was technically entitled to nothing from the Duke's estate. But the scale of his fraud, the deliberate nature of his deception, and the public sympathy generated by her treatment combined to create circumstances that the courts could not ignore. The trial itself lasted 3 weeks and became the most discussed legal proceeding of the decade. Every day, crowds gathered outside the courtroom, hoping to catch a glimpse of the principal figures in this extraordinary drama. Thessaly attended each session, dressed in simple dark colors that conveyed neither mourning nor celebration, her face composed in an expression that gave nothing away. She sat in the gallery and listened as witness after witness described her husband's cruelty, his calculations, and his utter disregard for the woman he had promised to love and cherish. Some of the testimony was difficult to hear. Servants spoke of finding her weeping alone in empty corridors. Former friends admitted to avoiding her because Aldrich had made it clear that anyone who showed her too much kindness would find themselves excluded from his social circle. A physician testified that he had treated her for symptoms of nervous exhaustion on multiple occasions, symptoms he now recognized as the result of prolonged emotional neglect. Through it all, Thessaly remained still and silent. She did not weep. She did not react. She simply listened and let the truth speak for itself. "Your grandmother's solicitors are quite formidable," Sibella observed one afternoon, joining Thessaly for tea in the townhouse's sunlit parlor. "They have managed to secure you a settlement that would make most actual duchesses envious." "I did not want his money," Thessaly replied, setting down her cup. "I wanted my freedom. The money is merely a consequence. A rather pleasant consequence, though." Thessaly allowed herself a small smile. "I suppose it is." She studied the woman across from her, this unexpected ally who had appeared from nowhere and changed everything. Sibella looked different now than she had on the night of the birthday celebration. Less perfect, perhaps, but more real. The elaborate hairstyles had given way to simpler arrangements. The distant elegance had softened into something warmer and more approachable. "Why did you do it?" Thessaly asked. "Why did you help us?" Sibella was silent for a moment, her gaze drifting to the window, where carriages passed in a steady stream. "Because he reminded me of someone," she finally said. "My husband. My actual husband, who died 2 years ago and left me with nothing but debts and regrets." She turned back to Thessaly, and there was old pain in her eyes. He was charming, too, in the beginning. Attentive, passionate, everything a woman could want. And then, slowly, he became everything a woman could fear. He took my money, my independence, my sense of self. By the time he died, I barely recognized my own reflection. She paused, her fingers tightening around her teacup. I spent 2 years after his death trying to rebuild myself, trying to remember who I had been before I met him, before I allowed him to reshape me into something that existed only to serve his needs. It was the hardest thing I have ever done. Harder than the poverty. Harder than the shame. Harder even than watching him die and feeling nothing but relief. Her jaw tightened. When Ravenmore approached me with his scheme, I saw my husband's face looking out of his eyes. The same arrogance, the same cruelty, the same absolute certainty that he could use another human being and discard her without consequence. She turned back to Thessaly. I decided that this time, the consequence would come, even if I had to deliver it myself. They sat in companionable silence for a while, 2 women who had both suffered at the hands of men who saw them as objects rather than people. The afternoon light slanted through the windows, painting golden stripes across the carpet. "What will you do now?" Thessaly finally asked. Sibella smiled, and this time the expression reached her eyes. "I have been offered a position," she said. "Your grandmother, it seems, requires someone with my particular talents to assist in managing her various enterprises. Apparently, intimidating men and uncovering secrets are skills in high demand." Thessaly laughed, a genuine laugh, perhaps the first she had produced in years. "My grandmother is a remarkable woman." "She is," Sibella agreed. "And so are you, Thessaly, whether you realize it yet or not." The days that followed brought more changes than Thessaly could have anticipated. Marin Blackwood, the servant girl whose courage had set everything in motion, was given a position in Corvina's household, with wages triple what she had earned at Ravenmore Hall. She would never again have to scrub floors or empty chamber pots or endure the casual cruelties of employers who saw her as invisible. The other servants from the Duke's estate, many of whom had witnessed years of his treatment toward his wife, came forward one by one with testimonies that strengthened the legal case against him. Each story painted a darker picture of the man Thessaly had married, revealing depths of manipulation and callousness that even she had not suspected. There was the cook who had been ordered to prepare separate meals for the Duke and Duchess, so that Aldrich would never have to share a dining table with his wife unless guests were present. There was the footman who had been instructed to intercept any letters addressed to Thessaly, from friends or family members and deliver them to the Duke first for approval. There was the housekeeper, who had been told that the Duchess was prone to hysteria and should be watched carefully for signs of mental instability, a lie that had colored every interaction the staff had with her for years. Each revelation was more damning than the last, and through it all, Thessaly began to understand just how thoroughly she had been isolated, how completely her husband had controlled every aspect of her existence without her ever realizing it. And slowly, tentatively, Thessaly began to remember who she had been before she became the Duchess of Ravenmore. She took up painting again, setting up an easel in her grandmother's garden and spending long afternoons capturing the play of light through leaves. At first, her hands trembled when she held the brush, and the colors she mixed were muddy and uncertain. But slowly, day by day, the skill returned, and with it came something else, something she had not expected. Joy. Pure, uncomplicated joy in the act of creation, in the transformation of blank canvas into something beautiful, in the knowledge that she was doing something, simply because she wanted to, not because anyone expected it of her. She began reading voraciously, devouring the books she had denied herself during her marriage, because Aldrich considered women's education a waste of time. Philosophy and history, and novels that transported her to worlds entirely unlike her own. She discovered that she had opinions, strong ones, about politics and art and the proper organization of society. Opinions she had never been permitted to express, let alone explore. She started taking walks through London's parks, without a chaperone, without a schedule, without anyone telling her where she should be or how she should behave. She learned the names of flowers she had never noticed before. She stopped to watch children playing, their laughter, a sound she had not truly heard in years. She sat on benches and fed pigeons and talked to strangers about the weather, and every small interaction felt like a miracle. For the first time in years, she was learning to exist as a person rather than a possession, and it was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. 3 months after the night that changed everything, Thessaly stood in the garden of her grandmother's Brighton estate and watched the sun set over the sea. The trial had concluded 2 weeks earlier. Aldrich had been found guilty on all charges and sentenced to 7 years' imprisonment, a remarkable outcome that owed as much to public outrage as to legal precedent. The newspapers had declared it a victory for justice, a warning to other men who might consider treating their wives as pawns in their personal games. The Ravenmore estate had been seized, pending the resolution of various civil claims against it. The servants had been dispersed to other households, many of them carrying letters of recommendation that Thessaly herself had written. The grand ballroom where she had finally spoken her truth would soon be shuttered and silent, its chandeliers darkened, its mirrors reflecting nothing but dust and memory. And Aldrich himself was gone, transported to a prison in the north, where he would spend the next 7 years contemplating the consequences of his cruelty. Thessaly had not attended the sentencing. She had not needed to. She had already said everything that needed to be said on that night 3 months ago when she had removed her ring and handed it to his mistress. Thessaly felt neither triumphant nor satisfied. She simply felt free. The gardens here were nothing like the manicured perfection of Ravenmore Hall. They were wild and rambling, full of roses that climbed wherever they pleased, and paths that wound through tangles of lavender and honeysuckle. Her grandmother had designed them deliberately, she said, to remind herself that beauty did not require control. A lesson Thessaly was still learning. Footsteps approached on the gravel path behind her, and she turned to find Corvina walking toward her with careful steps, one hand resting on a silver-handled cane she had recently begun using. "You will catch cold standing out here," her grandmother said. "The air is warm. The air is damp. At my age, there is little difference." Corvina reached her side and stood for a moment, gazing out at the water. The setting sun painted the waves in shades of gold and rose, and somewhere in the distance, a gull called its lonesome cry. "I received a letter today," she said, "from Aldrich's solicitors, the new ones." Thessaly felt a familiar tightness in her chest. "What do they want?" "He wishes to see you," Corvina said in a low voice, "before he is transferred to the prison in Yorkshire. He claims he has something to say to you. Something important." The tightness intensified. "I have no interest in anything he might say. I told them as much. But I wanted you to know that the request was made." They stood in silence, watching the colors of the sunset shift from gold to rose to deepening purple. The sea continued its eternal rhythm below, indifferent to the small dramas of human lives. "Do you regret it?" Corvina asked finally. "Any of it?" Thessaly considered the question carefully. She had asked it of herself many times in the past 3 months, lying awake in unfamiliar beds, staring at unfamiliar ceilings. "I regret marrying him," she said at last. "I regret believing that duty was more important than my own happiness. I regret the years I lost, trying to earn affection from someone incapable of giving it." She paused. "But I don't regret the woman I have become because of those years. I do not regret learning that I am stronger than I ever believed, and I do not regret standing in that ballroom and finally speaking the truth that I had been choking on for so long." Her grandmother nodded slowly. "You know," she said, "when I married your grandfather, I was terrified. I came from trade, from money earned rather than inherited. I expected his family to despise me, to make my life miserable, to remind me daily that I was not truly one of them." "And did they?" Corvina smiled, the expression softening the sharp lines of her face. "They tried. His mother, in particular, was a formidable opponent. But I learned something important during those early years of marriage. Something I wish I had taught you before you wed Ravenmore." "What was that?" "That other people's opinions of us are prisons only if we agree to be confined by them. That the walls society builds around women are made of nothing more substantial than expectations and assumptions. And that any wall made of such flimsy materials can be walked through by anyone brave enough to try." Her eyes met Thessaly's, filled with a fierce love that needed no words. "I watched you wither in that house for 6 years," she continued. "I watched you shrink yourself to fit into the small space he allowed you to occupy. I wrote you letters that I knew he was reading, hoping that somehow my words might reach you anyway. I waited, and I planned, and I prayed that someday you would find the strength to leave." She reached over and took Thessaly's hand. "You walked through your walls that night, child. You shattered them in front of witnesses, and now you have the rest of your life to build something new on the rubble." Thessaly felt tears prick at her eyes, the first she had allowed herself since that night. "I don't know what to build," she admitted. "I spent so long being what others expected me to be. I do not even know what I want." Corvina squeezed her hand. "Then that is the first thing you must discover. And you have all the time in the world to discover it." They stood together as the last light faded from the sky and the first stars began to appear. Grandmother and granddaughter, united by bonds stronger than blood alone. The sea murmured against the shore below, a constant rhythm that had existed long before either of them was born, and would continue long after they were both gone. Thessaly thought about the girl she had been years ago, standing at an altar in a white dress, speaking vows to a man she barely knew. That girl had been so certain that love could be earned through devotion, that patience and propriety would eventually unlock even the most guarded heart. That girl had been wrong, but she had also been brave in her own limited way. Brave enough to step into the unknown, brave enough to hope, brave enough to try. And perhaps, Thessaly reflected, that bravery had never truly left her. Perhaps it had simply been buried beneath years of disappointment and despair, waiting for the right moment to emerge. The night of her birthday had been that moment. The instant when Aldrich had walked through those ballroom doors with Sibella on his arm, something inside Thessaly had finally snapped. Not broken, she realized now. Snapped free. Like a bird finally released from a cage it had inhabited for so long it had forgotten what flight felt like. And now, after everything, Thessaly was still brave. Brave enough to leave. Brave enough to speak. Brave enough to stand alone in the darkness and trust that the dawn would come. She removed her hand from her grandmother's grasp and reached up to touch her bare ring finger, the place where the sapphire had once rested. The skin there had tanned slightly over the past 3 months, erasing the pale band that had marked her as someone's property. Soon, there would be no visible trace of the ring at all. But Thessaly did not need a visible trace to remember. She would carry the lesson of those years for the rest of her life, the knowledge of what it meant to be seen and not valued, to be possessed and not loved, to be displayed and not cherished. These were wounds that might never fully heal, but they were also teachers, instructing her in what she would never again accept. And she would carry, too, the knowledge of what it meant to finally break free, to remove the ring, to speak the words, to walk away from everything comfortable and familiar and safe toward something unknown and frightening and entirely her own. The Duchess removed her ring and said, "Take him." And then she took herself back.